Well, I'd like to thank both our speakers for two very stimulating and thought-provoking talks. And I'd just like to pursue the subjects with a couple of basic questions that I think are mostly clarifying. So Anne, I had a question for you. I suppose it's about your concept of personhood, the one that you're using in this talk. You noted, for example, that in some famous cases of genocide and racism, there were notorious cases of people denying personhood to others. So Nazis denied personhood to Jews, or right, but they knew they were human, of course. But and of course, it seems to me that if you want to deny a human being certain basic rights, like a right to life or a right to liberty, your first step might be to deny that they're a person, because we think of a person as the holder of certain kinds of rights. And if someone asked me what a person is, I might say, well, a person is something that has a right to life. It has certain moral entitlements, rights certain to liberty. Now, at other points in your talk, I got the idea that you were using the word person in a different way. When you said, for example, when we have a waitress, we're not thinking of her as a person. She's just a servant who's bringing us something. That seemed right. That's the way I'm thinking about her or him, perhaps. But I wouldn't have thought of myself as denying them personhood. And when you said we have a maximum of 150 people with whom we can have something like a substantive relationship, I would say, well, that's right. But it wouldn't have occurred to me to think of people outside my circle of 150 as not persons, insofar as they have a right to life, they have a right to the same moral protection that any other human being does. So I wonder, maybe you could clarify a little bit when you are using the word person, how you are using it exactly.
There are different concepts of personhood that we all have to take into consideration. As a theologian, I do believe that every human being is a person in the eyes of God. And that is given to us through the image of God in the Bible and through all the promises that are made. But at the same time, we human beings are limited to assign each other personhood. We have profound limits. We cannot do that. We might abstractly believe in something like human rights, but when push comes to shove, we do not treat beings who should be treated as persons necessarily as persons, because we have this limit, this physiological limit. At the same time, though, we are very much willing to assign personhood to non-human beings. Okay? So in my opinion, when we, I want to get rid of the idea that the term human and the term person is interchangeable, because it is not. So I have the theological affirmation that assigns personhood to each human being, and I have the human limit that basically our assignment of personhood is quite arbitrary and limited. We basically assign personhood to everyone who plays a continuous role in our lives, right? And so, for instance, these little movies I showed, when a person that looked like a professor type would ask a student on campus for directions, they always would notice a change, right? So only if it was someone like the student asked the professor type, right? Or the person with a working helmet asked the student. So when the hierarchy of the questioner was supposed to be lower, on a lower level, perceived to be low on a lower level, then sometimes there wouldn't no sex changes, race changes. I mean, it was just because there was this feeling of the people who were asked for direction. Why should I care? And that is not something evil, okay? That is just simply the way we are built. The problem, though, is, and that is where the next question comes in, where we come into the ethics of it, that we human beings are not very good in accepting physiological limits, and especially not mental limits, And so we usually try to create stories, narratives that justify, So for instance, when someone who grows up in a purely Caucasian society, and by 9 months is therefore already not able anymore to distinguish between Asian faces or African faces, right? That's simply a physiological limit that comes from our developmental psychology, but we are not good with that. So of course then we create the narrative, oh, they're all the same anyway, right? So instead of kind of trying to teach ourselves when we then encounter people who look different, where we know our brain cannot recognize, to teach ourselves to distinguish, we justify our limitations with narratives and become therefore even more exclusive. And that's the problem. So I'm kind of weighing constantly the idea of our limits and God's universal affirmation. And so the AI for me is a beautiful thinking tool to address that. Does that clarify?
Well, at one point you were emphasizing that we must beware any attempt to adopt an empirical criterion for personhood, because it seems invariably that whatever criterion we adopt, there'll be counterexamples. So if we say that rationality is a criterion for personhood, then, well, what about a person with advanced Alzheimer's and so forth, or a baby and so forth? And we can kind of go through most of the candidates, right? The ability to act intentionally and so forth, the ability to engage in ethical decision making. Gee, these all seem like they'd be good possible definitions, but there's always going to be counterexamples. So I guess I'm left with the question, how do we identify a person when we see one? If we were to get to the point of counting robots as persons, what would lead us to think they were, if there are in fact no empirical criteria for personhood?
Our own reaction to them.
So our own reaction would be an infallible indicator of
not at all.
personhood?
Not at all. It won't be infallible. This is kind of why this is why I bring the golem tradition in, because the rabbis who built the golems, look, we don't know if a golem ever was built, right? I mean, it's highly, highly questionable. But at least they were thinking for hundreds of years about the question. And I think that they thought that a golem represents God's creative power in us, and that these are basically the highest imaginable creatures we can create because they are so complex and like us, and that because there is some doubt, we make them keep the Sabbath just to be on the safe side. I think that kind of creates the doubt and the ambiguity, and yet also the capability to include them. But it would never be, it would never be on a, all robots are persons. No. It would only be on a one-on-one, on a case-to-case, if they're human beings who would be willing to let that robot in.
But invariably, am I right in thinking that the human beings will be reacting to something, some empirical property that the robots have that's stimulating this judgment that there is personhood, which kind of gets us back to the original worry, right? That, wait a minute, any empirical property they point to can be abused, right? Because they'll fail to recognize certain legitimate counterexamples, right?
Yeah.
So it seems like there's a problem now. We're running into the same problem. I mean, we tried to avoid having an empirical criterion of personhood, but we're going to have one, right, in some sense. Right.
Yes, but my question is, would the robot ever be considered to be an image of God? And to some extent, as my M.I.T. colleagues who come from the golem tradition have said, you could actually ask yourself, perhaps God has created us to create artificial intelligence. Right? In which case, I mean, when you think about it, the idea behind the golems was whenever we are, as human beings, we are creative, we celebrate God's creativity in us. And when we are able to rebuild ourselves, we celebrate God the most. And therefore, the creative output of our creativity and imagination is therefore indirectly also an image of God.